The following is a presentation of VBR. Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our study of God's holy word.
Number 77 in our series on the book of Acts, picking up at the end of Acts chapter 26. Acts 26 tells of Paul's defense of the Christian faith before King Agrippa and Agrippa's sister Bernice, along with the Roman governor Festus and a group of the most important military officers and wealthier, more influential citizens of Caesarea. The meeting concluded with Paul affirming that he wanted Agrippa and everyone else who was there listening to him to become Christians, as he himself was a Christian. The meeting concluded on that note, and we pick up the story with the conclusion of the Jewish king and Roman governor Agrippa and Festus as they mused about what they had seen and heard. Acts chapter 26, verses 30 through 32, reading from the English Standard Version. Then the king arose, and the governor, and Bernice, and those who were sitting with them. And when they had withdrawn, they said to one another, "This man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment." And Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. So the observation of the governor and the observation of Agrippa and his sister Bernice was that Paul not only had done nothing, he was doing nothing. He was not guilty of any serious crimes whatsoever, nothing that deserved imprisonment, let alone death, and the whole matter should have been dropped and dismissed. Felix, of course, had not dropped the matter. He had kept Paul in prison for 2 years, just as a favor to the Jews, unwilling to further alienate the Jews who already had many grudges against him. And Festus, on looking at the circumstances, realized that it was all a sham. There was nothing here. Nevertheless, by this time, Paul had, in fact, appealed to Caesar, and so that was on record and was the thing that was going to happen. But Agrippa had not succeeded in the one thing that Festus hoped he would do, which was to give him some good idea of what to write as a charge against Paul when sending him to Caesar to face Nero. So Festus really had no specific charges to send with Paul, other than the fact that the Jews had accused him of things, and perhaps there would be Jews who would make their accusations in an actual trial before Nero. Continuing into Acts chapter 27, having concluded that Paul would be sent to Rome, Acts 27 verses 1 through 3. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius, and embarking on a ship to Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. So we have the we in this passage. That is, Luke is part of this party that is going from Caesarea to Rome. Luke is in the group that's traveling here. The last time that Luke had included himself in the group was back in chapter 21, verse 18, when we, Paul and the men from Achaia, Macedonia, and Galatia, had brought the gift to the Jewish elders, Acts 21:18. Luke had included himself in that party. We met with James and the other elders there. And Luke has not included himself in any of the events since then, but most likely he stayed in the area of Caesarea Judea. Most likely this is when he was doing the interviews that resulted in writing the book of Luke and the early part of the book of Acts here. This is probably when he was accumulating that information, talking to eyewitnesses and so forth, reviewing sources. But Luke now is part of the party that is continuing on as Paul goes from Caesarea to Rome. Julius, the centurion, he's otherwise unknown to us. We have no other account of him other than what is mentioned about him here in Acts 27:28. And the Augustan cohort, this would have been a fairly common description of an imperial regiment, an imperial group of soldiers. And so we don't really have any particular historical details about the specifics of this man or this group of Roman soldiers. Adramyttium was a port on the west coast of Asia, southeast of Troas. So this ship is bound for a port that is up on the western shore, the western coast of what we today would refer to as Turkey, as Asia. It would have been a trading vessel. It's described as going from port to port. It was going to go along the ports, along the coast of Asia, of what we call Turkey, and making stops all along the way. Now, they could have taken that ship all the way to its destination, but that wasn't the most direct route to Rome. And so they started out on this vessel going from port to port, but with the intention of catching a connection elsewhere down the line. Aristarchus, who's mentioned here by name, joined Paul in Ephesus back in Acts 19:29. It was mentioned that Paul had these fellow travelers from Ephesus who were going to go with him on the journey that was to take him to Jerusalem. And they had recently arrived in Acts 19:29, and Aristarchus was one of those who was seized by the crowd, one of the companions of Paul that was seized by the crowd in the riot there. And he accompanied Paul to Jerusalem in Acts chapter 20 and verse 4 when the large group of men was traveling there and carrying the donation from the churches to Jerusalem. And here again, he's part of the party with Paul going to Rome. He's mentioned again later when Paul, from Rome, as a prisoner in Rome, when he wrote the letters of Colossians and Philemon, he mentioned Aristarchus. In Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10, he refers to Aristarchus as his fellow prisoner. Not necessarily saying that he was under arrest, but that he was joining Paul in his imprisonment and was a prisoner for Christ's sake, that he was sharing in Paul's difficult circumstances there in Rome. But he was Paul's fellow prisoner, he said in Colossians 4:10, and in Philemon, and Philemon was a resident of the area at around Colossae there. He was a part of that church. Philemon 1:24, Aristarchus is mentioned among those who were Paul's fellow workers with a few other names, my fellow workers. So Aristarchus probably worked as an evangelist, was from the church in Thessalonica, was a traveling companion of Paul several times, and at length in the latter years of his ministry from about AD 58 up through at least through the Roman imprisonment several years later. Paul apparently, according to his own line of teaching, that you can see by the way I live that I'm very serious about the Christian faith, imitate me as I imitate Christ, those kinds of things that Paul repeatedly avers both in his conversation with the elders of the church in Ephesus back in the 19th chapter of Acts, as well as in his various letters. Paul undoubtedly came across as a trustworthy individual, and we have that taken note of here, that Paul was trustworthy, because he had a positive impact on the centurion, on Julius, and he was allowed in Sidon to go apart and to stay with friends and to have his friends take care of his needs while he was there in Sidon. Now, it's possible that Julius and Paul had been acquainted with each other in Caesarea during the 2 years that Paul spent there, but it also may be that Julius had recently come from Rome with messages and then was taking the prisoners from Caesarea back to Rome. We don't really know, but at least by the time they come to Sidon, which isn't very far down the road in their traveling, at least by this time, the centurion has some trust in Paul, whether from long experience over a couple of years or from recent acquaintance and just seeing the quality of man that Paul was. Sidon was about 70 miles north of Caesarea. It's an ancient Phoenician city. It's mentioned in the Bible in the Old Testament several times, as well as in some of the words of Jesus as one of the great Phoenician cities, a partner with Tyre. Tyre and Sidon often mentioned in conjunction with one another. It was not a great Phoenician city anymore, but it was still an important port on the coast of Syria there that was in heavy use in Roman times. So Paul had friends in Sidon. Previously, in Acts 21, verses 3 through 6, it was mentioned that when Paul came to Tyre, they spent a week with the brethren in Tyre. That was when Paul was still free before the riot in Jerusalem's temple area, before Paul was arrested. But Paul was acquainted with Christians in Tyre, and they were delighted to have him visit, and he spent a week with the believers in Tyre. We don't have any mention of Paul having previously visited Sidon. It may very well be that they stopped there on an occasion in their travels to and from Syria that Luke just didn't mention. Or it may be that Paul had visited Sidon during the years that he worked in Cilicia around Tarsus before coming to Antioch to work alongside Barnabas back in the 11th chapter of Acts. But Paul had friends in Sidon, and by friends, I think we can presume that they were most likely believers as he was, but friends in Sidon, and Paul was known over a large area, a large region of that world. He had a lot of friends scattered over Syria, Cilicia, and into the areas where he had gone preaching the gospel in Galatia and Asia and so forth. Lots of ports for him in times of trouble. Continuing on in Acts 27 and verses 4 through 8, putting out to sea from there, that is from Sidon, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, and as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone, coasting along with difficulty. We came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Now what Luke is recording for us here are the details of an eyewitness, someone who made the trip, someone who had a travel log, to speak, so to speak, a journal of the places they stopped and things they did along the way. And Luke's travelogue here in chapter 27, describing the journey and the shipwreck, is regarded as a literary masterpiece. It is some of the finest Greek writing that survives from antiquity, and it is the best existing account of an ancient sea voyage, and particularly of the shipwreck and all of the matters associated with that. It is just simply good reading. It's a story very well told here in Acts chapter 27. So they went out to sea, Luke says. They put out to sea from Sidon, and we sailed under the lee of Cyprus. That's not a direction per se, but that's describing the fact that on this occasion, because of the direction that the wind was blowing, they sailed north of Cyprus to shelter from the late summer winds that were from the west, and which was inhibiting their westward progress. So they sailed around the north of Cyprus in order to have Cyprus, the island of Cyprus, as a sort of windbreak to allow them to make some westward progress. But as Luke says, they were having a hard time of it. Things weren't going along real quick or real well. They didn't have the kind of wind that they need. And then they crossed the open sea between Cyprus and the coast of Cilicia. And Cilicia, we've made reference to before. That's where Tarsus was, where Paul spent his childhood, where he was born and spent his childhood, and where he went when he left Jerusalem back in Acts chapter 9. He went to Tarsus in Cilicia, and he preached and started churches in Cilicia for several years before Luke came and brought him, or not Luke, excuse me, before Barnabas came and brought Paul to Antioch. So the ship is sailing along between Cyprus and the coast of Cilicia there on the southeast area of Turkey, of Asia. And Paul on this journey, remember, was a prisoner. And as a prisoner now on shipboard with no freedom to go ashore and to schedule various visits, he's passing by a number of cities and churches that he had previously visited, churches that he had previously established, brethren he would no doubt have loved to connect with and communicate with and give encouragement to. But as a prisoner, he is en route to Rome, and they're bypassing those various connections that Paul had in past years. And they went on to Myra, and this is on the south coast of Turkey there, further along than Cilicia. And that's normally a voyage of 10 or 15 days from Sidon. So we can surmise that they have been out of Sidon at least a couple of weeks at this point in time. And I say at least because Luke says that the going was kind of difficult. The winds were not in their favor. And there at Myra, they changed ships. Changing ships in that location, they went from the trader that was going to go on around and up the coast of Asia there to a trader that was going directly toward Italy, that was going to take a more southerly route around the tip of Greece and so forth. A ship that was bound for Italy, a ship from Alexandria, very important city in those days in Egypt, a city of Greek origin founded with the name of Alexander the Great, and a city of significant learning. Remember, that's where Apollos was from. Apollos was mentioned at the end of Acts chapter 18, was from Alexandria, the one who preached very eloquently about Jesus, but only knew the baptism of John until Aquila and Priscilla took him aside and gave him additional instructions. Alexandria was a great trading port in those days, and so this ship from Alexandria was en route to Rome, and they didn't sail directly across to Rome. That was a lot of open sea. Instead, they took a less direct route, going up and around and then coming across below Greece to make their way to Rome. But they found this ship at Myra on the south coast of Asia, and then they turned west on this ship to follow the coast to go along to Italy. And as Luke says, again, this is difficult progress they're making. The winds were not favorable. Cnidus, that's mentioned here, is pretty much the southwestern extremity of Asia, the southwestern extremity of Turkey, just on the corner, so to speak, of the landmass there. And it's 150 miles from Myra, so probably another 10 to 15 days have passed. They have been more or less a month at this point out of Caesarea. Maybe a little more, but more or less a month out of Caesarea at this point. The progress is going slow because the weather, the winds, are not in their favor. As the wind did not allow us to go farther, Luke wrote. And that sounds like sailing toward Crete was an adjustment in their itinerary. They couldn't continue west as they wanted to. And so instead they dipped southward, going down toward Crete, making a shift in their sailing, the path that they were going to follow in the direction they were sailing, turning south when they would have preferred to continue westward toward Greece. So all along the way already, this journey has been fraught with difficulties, has been challenging, has not gone forward in an expeditious manner. They're being hindered all along the way. And now they've turned out to sea down toward Crete. Progress continued to be difficult. The winds continued to be unfavorable. They came to a port midway on the south side of Crete, and they're swinging south of Crete again to avoid the winds, to be able to make progress contrary to the prevailing winds that they've been dealing with. So they came to a port midway on Crete's south side, and this is the only record we have, the only specific mention we have of Paul visiting Crete. And this was a brief visit, and he was a prisoner at the time, so he couldn't have done any significant work on Crete at this moment in time. But later, when he wrote Titus, the letter of Titus, he alluded to having spent some length of time there, and then he left Crete and left Titus to finish up the work among the churches, plural, and appoint elders in all of the churches there before Titus left Crete himself. So we have indication that at a later time than this, and this is one of the reasons that most who follow the New Testament account believe that Paul had freedom once again for a time, that after his trial before Caesar, he had freedom once again for a time, and that among the places he went to Crete for a while, along with Titus, and started churches there. And that's much later than this, was several years later than the current account we have here. We have Paul writing that letter to Titus. So after Paul was 2 years in Caesarea as a prisoner, and then a long voyage to Rome, and then 2 years as a prisoner in Rome, and after that, the chronology is not specific because that's the end of Luke's chronology. Sometime after that, Paul apparently did resume his traveling and preaching, and Crete was one of those places that he went back to in order to preach the gospel there. Acts 27, verses 9 through 12, at this point they're in that port on the south coast of Crete, and it's not a great place to spend the winter, as we'll read here in Acts 27, verses 9 through 12. Since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous. Remember, there was more than a month just in the travel from Caesarea to coming aboard this ship and then down to Crete here. Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of cargo in the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the harbor there. And when Paul mentions, or when Luke mentions rather the fast, the timing here, the fast was already over. He's talking about the Day of Atonement. That is the one day of fasting prescribed in the law of Moses. The Day of Atonement, the 10th day of the 7th month, was the day when they were to deny themselves. That's the one prescribed fast in the Old Testament, in the law of Moses. 7th month and 10th day, which is late September to early October. In the time frame of late September, early October, as we're coming in from summer into fall at this point. A Jewish custom considered sailing after the Feast of Tabernacles, which comes on the 15th day of the 7th month. Jewish custom considered sailing after the Feast of Tabernacles to be foolhardy, to be very, very risky. The Romans considered sailing after the middle of September to be very risky, and sailing after the first week or so of November to be basically suicidal. It was crazy to sail that late in the season on the Mediterranean, according to Roman custom, and fairly similar with the Jewish customs. So Paul here delivers a prophetic word, and it may be particularly by inspiration, but it also is tempered by the fact that Paul had plenty of experience in sailing. He had been on ships many times. We have several references in Luke's accounts of Paul's travels here in the book of Acts to Paul traveling by sea. But we don't by any means have an exhaustive list, because Paul had already written 2 Corinthians at this point, and that had been more than 2 years earlier that Paul had written 2 Corinthians. He had written in 2 Corinthians 11:25, 3 times I was shipwrecked, a night and a day I was adrift at sea. Luke doesn't give us any account of the times when Paul was shipwrecked, but prior to this journey, prior to being on this Alexandrian ship, Paul had already experienced shipwreck 3 times, so he was a little bit of an expert in this area. He knew something about the hazards of sailing on the Mediterranean Sea from personal experience. And so Paul warned of great risk and great cost if they proceeded, and potentially of loss of life as well, that they would be endangering themselves if they continued with the voyage at this point in time, this late in the year, and with the kind of weather that was prevailing. But time is money. And the ship's captain and pilot intended to proceed. They had not set out from Alexandria with the intention of waiting until spring to go to Rome. They had set out from Alexandria with the intention of going to Rome with their cargo and getting a good price for it, not having it moldering in the holds of the ship for all that time. So the captain and the pilot of the ship wanted to proceed, and they wanted the prisoners and the Roman soldiers to travel with them, because after all, that's additional income. As well as being a benefit to them in some ways to have those hands aboard. And the centurion was more impressed with the arguments of the captain and of the pilot than he was with the arguments of Paul. So he determined to continue on. He was kind to Paul. It said that when they stopped in sight, and the centurion was kind to Paul. He was well disposed toward him, but he weighed the options, the opinions of the professional seamen, and he considered those to have more authority, more gravity than the opinions of Paul and the warnings that Paul gave. And so the decision was made, and most of the passengers on the ship, most of the crew, most of the people involved in the voyage, who were allowed apparently to express their opinions, disagreed with Paul and thought it better to try and go a little further along the coast of Crete, along the southern shore, to a better harbor named Phoenix to winter in. And Phoenix, as Luke describes it here, and as is the reality, very important and much used harbor on Crete, Phoenix was oriented in such a way that it was well protected from the winds and was a safe berth to spend the winter in. So they looked, the seamen looked at with practical eyes and said, this is not a good place to stay, that's much better. And if we get closer to our goal, maybe we can keep on going. They wanted the funds, the money, and so forth. This was what was driving them. And so as we now continue the story of Paul and this journey to Rome, the next thing we're going to read about is the fact that Paul was right and they were wrong. And we're going to be seeing a terrific storm at sea. And Luke's description of that storm is, again, a classic of ancient literature. It's dramatic. It's descriptive in ways that evoke your sense of being there and seeing what's taking place. It's written in excellent Greek. It is great literature, besides being a beautiful account of the providence of God. And as we read the story in our next session, as we read the story, we're going to consider not just the facts that Luke relates, but the fact that this is a display of the power of God. It's the power of God that is seen in the deliverance of Israel from Egypt, in Jesus' power over the elements, and it's the providence of God. Not so much in what is an obvious miracle as the fact that God sustains his people and brings them through emergencies and crises and delivers them safely on the other side. So we'll take that up next time in Acts 27 and verse 13.